Okay, it's a great honor to welcome once again to this program Nicholas Eberstadt of the American Enterprise Institute. Um, Today, I would like to discuss his article, which was published in 2022 in National Affairs. It's titled "The Future of Global Population." Nick, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
Thank you for inviting me back.
Yes, it's always a great pleasure to welcome you. So the essay was originally presented at a Hudson Institute conference celebrating the life of Max Singer. Hudson Institute's his co-founder. Tell me more about him.
Well, Max Singer was a remarkable man, and I knew him for, I suppose, close to 40 years. We met in the early 1980s when I moved to Washington, D.C. Uh, at that point, he had already moved on to other endeavors post Hudson. He and the great Herman Kahn, who had left Rand Corporation to start new endeavors, put together the Hudson Institute, and as its name suggests, it was on the banks of the Hudson River at that time, on the coast rather than the West Coast, where Rand Corporation had been, to pursue various endeavors involved in what you might call futurology, or trying to think about what the future might look like. And Herman Kahn passed away in the early 80s, 84, as I recall. Max lived on for almost well, for more than 30 years after that. And he was a remarkable mind, very, very supple intelligence, able to get to he would ask these questions which seemed almost idiotically simple. And when you actually started to kind of like wrap your arms around them, you realized how complex and contingent and nuanced they were. And through various, through our personal friendship, through various projects we did together, we worked on demographic questions. We worked on questions about the future of Russia and China and North Korea. And he was a deeply devout Jew. He was a committed Zionist. During the last several decades of his life, he spent most of his time in Israel, where his children and grandchildren were growing up. You'd never meet him without being peppered by questions that you'd never thought about before, and sometimes they gave you a headache, but kind of in a good way. And he was a kind, generous, wonderful, sweet man.
Yes. And in the essay, you made multiple references to his 2011 book, History of the Future. So, of course, tell me more about that book.
Well, I think that was his. It was not his final work, but probably his most important, later work in his life. And he was trying to engage in intelligent uh, but rigorous speculation about what the unknown future might hold for humanity, and uh, talking about things which have not come to pass. Um, is a sort of an invitation to charlatanism, because it's unprovable. Anything that hasn't happened yet, can't be falsified. But Max was trying to talk about the trajectory for human beings in a way that built upon what we knew from history, from the human experience about modern economic development, and what we knew about human nature. And since he did not expect that human nature was going to change, which seems like a pretty reasonable supposition, uh, he believed that the modern economic development formula uh, offered the potential for essentially unlimited prosperity in the future based upon human ingenuity, new ideas, application of new ideas and knowledge. He had a guarded view of politics and thought that increasingly the world would be living under societies that would move towards satisfying the wishes and needs of the individual, but was also very well aware of how uh, easily political institutions can be destroyed and how easily some of the darker sides of humanity can prevail in politics. And uh, given my own background in my interests in population questions, I was particularly intrigued by his musings about demographics, which would probably seem rather superficial to many assistant professors of sociology or economics who specialized in demography, but struck me as being um, remarkably deep and penetrating. And so that was really what I was getting into in that essay you're referring to in National Affairs.
Mhm. Yes. So as a demographer, to what extent can the tools of demography reliably predict the future?
Well, that's an excellent question, and it's one that students of population continue to wrestle with somewhat unsuccessfully. Uh, look at look at the look at it three ways. There are three basic ingredients to population change. There's birth, there's death, and there's movement in or out of a country, a society, a population, however you want to look at it. Um, in non-catastrophic situations, the tools of population arithmetic, population give us a pretty good way of calculating survival schedules. I mean, that's why there's an insurance industry, or more specifically, that's why there's an insurance industry that doesn't go bankrupt. It's because these are very regular uh, relationships that can be anticipated in advance. As I say, absent catastrophes of biblical proportion, absent a terrible war, absent, asteroid strike, absent complete upheaval. So on anticipating the trends for an existing alive population, demography is pretty good.
Mhm.
Demography has little to offer, finds itself at sea when we start discussing forecasts for birth rates. And in my view, the reason for this is because, uh, at least up until now, until we get into the mass production of Homo sapiens, human beings, some sort of dystopian future, uh, births are basically volitional in among our kind. And there's really no way for a demographer or an economist or a quant of any sort to anticipate the future trends in volition. And that means that the further into the future you get, the more speculative you are about birth trends. And by the time that you get into trying to guess how many babies the currently unborn are going to have, you're really into science fiction. You really don't have any basis in your method for doing something. So we've got, a pretty good handle on. Second one is kind of uh, beyond our ken. And then there's migration. And migration demographers are basically out of their league in dealing with, because migration isn't while it may be a demographic phenomenon, it is not driven by demographic phenomena. Uh, the sorts of forces that are entailed in movements of human beings across borders are largely economic, opportunity, or um, stress, um, political, sometimes humanitarian catastrophes. And there's just no, I think there is no way for demography to anticipate this in any accurate, rigorous fashion. There are people who believe they have models for accurately or relatively accurately forecasting or projecting migration. I'm not terribly impressed by these so far, at least not yet. Uh, there are people who work on probabilistic projections of births and migrations. It makes it sound as if it's a little bit more precise and serious when you say that it's probabilistic, but probabilistic projections, in my view, work very much better for natural phenomena, like for trying to calculate a planetary orbit, or for long-term patterns, in geology, than they do for matters in which human volition is central, such as demography.
Mhm. All right. So following up on that, how much stock do you put in the maxim of demography is destiny?
Well, um, it's a wonderful phrase, isn't it? I mean, it promises a lot. Uh, it's attributed to a polymath from the 19th century named Auguste Comte.
Mm,
Uh,
yeah.
and it's not clear to me that he ever actually said it, but it's usually attributed to him. And there were a great number of remarkable things about Auguste Comte. But from my own standpoint, I mean, Auguste is a socialist and Auguste is a Frenchman, and I'm neither of those things. So I'd want to have a friendly American amendment to it, I suppose. And if I were able to reformulate it, it certainly wouldn't be memorable the way that epigram is. But I'd say that demography slowly but very unforgivingly alters the realm of the possible. You see the difference between that rather loquacious description and demography is destiny. What's missing in demography is destiny is the human agency that I try to insert in there, because uh, even if even if population change is altering the world in ways that are fixed and constrained at any given moment, human beings have a lot of options. They've got a lot of options, even in a changing demographic situation. And it's awfully important, I think, to recognize that.
Mhm. Yes. Yeah, as an aside, yeah, Auguste Comte is such a fascinating figure. I think so many social science disciplines can be traced back to him.
Yeah, a remarkable man.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, so ever since I was born, the assumption is that the world's the country with the largest population in the world is China. But right now it has changed. So that country now is India. So I wonder, um, to what extent could you have predicted India to surpass China as the world's most populous country?
I think it has been apparent for some time that India was on a path to exceed China's national population. I don't think anybody would have pinpointed the year, um, say back in 2000 or in 1990, but it would have been easy enough in a very crude way to anticipate that India would be on a path to have eventually a larger population for some period of time than China. The reason, quite simply, is that by uh, by about a generation ago, more babies were being born in India than in China, and uh, all other things being equal, given the rather higher level of fertility in India at that time than in China, which had fallen below the replacement level already by that point. The demographic momentum would suggest a surpassing of China's population by India. Now, India at this point, as you may know, has already itself fallen below the replacement level. India's overall childbearing patterns now are insufficient to maintain a stable population indefinitely in the future without immigration. So India, too, is at this point on a path which would eventually imply population peaking and declining. But China has already peaked. India's peaking would not be occurring for, let us say, hypothetically, another generation or maybe slightly more or less than that, at which point its human numbers would peak at a noticeably higher level than China's peak, than the peak China that we saw a year or so ago.
Mhm. Yes. I also remember growing up, there's this overwhelming anxiety towards overpopulation. I hear this a lot about like, how the world will reach like 10 billion people by the year 2100 and such. But nowadays, I don't seem to hear the same conversation being said. So I wonder, as you are more attuned to this more than I am, to what extent has the conversation around overpopulation changed or remained the same?
Well, I'm a lot older than you are, and when I started doing population homework in the early 1970s, uh, there was a sort of a moral panic in a lot of educated uh, elite circles and in government circles as well about the what was called the population explosion at that time. Well, I mean, it certainly was a population explosion. The planet was seeing the most rapid increase in human numbers, and the largest increase in human numbers that had ever occurred. I mean, between 1900 and the year 2000, uh, human numbers probably quadrupled, maybe slightly more than quadrupled, 1.5 billion to over 6 billion persons. Obviously, nothing like that had ever happened before. It couldn't have happened before. Uh, but what was misconstrued, I believe, was the reason for this explosion and the implications of the explosion. I mean, the global population did not surge like that because people had suddenly started breeding like rabbits. Uh, it surged because they had finally stopped dying like flies. Uh, Between 1900 and the year 2000, the global life expectancy at birth likely more than doubled. We don't know precisely because the numbers aren't good enough for 1900, but around 30 years life expectancy at birth for people in the world in 1900, around 30 years at birth, not too long. By the year 2000, for the planet as a whole, it was over 60, maybe 65. Um, so everything that was occurring was due to this improvement in life expectancy and this improvement in health. And by the way, that improvement in life expectancy and health has continued on since then. Uh, no, it seemed to me And this is why I was considered a kind of a contrarian or maybe even a crank by some at the time. Um, it seemed to me that if you were going to have a population problem, so-called, a health explosion is a pretty good one to have. Something that everybody would want. Um, it'd have a very auspicious economic implications too. It wouldn't necessarily mean that there'd be increased productivity and wealth. That would depend upon the business climate and upon applying the new potential. And there are a lot of ways of uh, spoiling that application of potential. But as a prospect, it was a very good one. And that is part of the reason why, despite a quadrupling of the world's population, the proportion of humanity in extreme poverty plummeted and the per capita output in the world surged. It didn't surge evenly. There were some areas where it surged much more than in other places, but all around the world it surged. All around the world, uh, nutrition improved. All around the world, education improved, and the material abundance of life uh, became more apparent.
So to what extent has the COVID pandemic affected this growth trajectory?
It's a hugely interesting question. I don't know that I can answer it as well as I'd like. Maybe in a decade or so, people will be able to answer this better, reflecting back on it. I mean, in in the immediate shock of the COVID pandemic, uh, there was a terrible toll of excess deaths. We know that. There are many countries in the world where, first of all, vital registration of statistics don't really exist yet. They're not complete. So death tallies weren't accurately kept. Even in countries where death tallies are accurately kept, they don't always tally the cause of death accurately. But if you want to talk about the surge of deaths associated with that shock, we might be talking about 20 million, up to 20 million excess deaths. Some say 16 million, but it was a very large number. India was probably the hardest hit. Um, After the first wave, China was eventually hit. Of course, the Chinese government does not divulge the true numbers, but it's plausible to think that many millions of people have also died in China since the government's U-turn on lockdowns. The United States and Russia both suffered million deaths apiece, maybe slightly more. Um, and other countries, many other countries as well, all around the world, Latin America, and Asia, Europe, Sub-Sahara, of course. Um, Difficult to understand now is the impact of the shock on birth rates, family formation, and fertility. Um, it appears at the moment that the COVID shock also brought about a shock to fertility trends, and not an increase in birth rates because everybody was huddled together, locked down. The opposite, an acceleration of drop of falls in fertility. Um, the numbers that are coming in now from Latin America, I think, are astonishing. I mean, I'm just picking a couple off the top of my head. Uh, it's not the Latin America that I grew up hearing about. Let's say that uh, in uh, in Costa Rica, uh, birth level associated with 1.2 children per woman per lifetime. Remember that you need slightly more than 2 kids for a continuation of stability in population without immigration. Uh, in in Uruguay down to 1.2, in Chile down to 1.1, in Bogota less than 1 birth per woman per lifetime, in Mexico City less than 1 birth per woman per lifetime. This is not the so-called teeming third world that one was told about a generation or two ago when the phrase of overpopulation had great purchase.
Now, going to your home country of the US, I read that by 2040 or 2050, half the population of the US will be of the minority, so I guess non-Hispanic whites. Um, to what extent do you find that to be true, and what possible, I suppose, political implications can you think of with that info?
Uh, it seems quite possible that the so-called Anglo, the non-Hispanic white ethnic group in our racial categorizations in the United States, it seems quite possible that this will hold true for the U.S. with the critical assumption, remember, about immigration. How does one project immigration? With the critical assumption that Census Bureau assumptions about continuing migration from abroad in more or less the same patterns that we have seen over the past generation or two hold into the future. It's always a question. It's always an uncertain question. What uh, what will become of migration trends and flows in the future for any country? We have seen in the United States in the past very strong reactions against migration. We have our own myth in the United States that we're a nation of immigrants, and it's true enough. I mean, most countries are nations of immigrants if you go back far enough. But it has not always been the case that the U.S. has been welcoming to newcomers from abroad. In our last in our previous golden age, gilded era, back in the late 1800s, in the first era of globalization, the United States had a tremendous influx of foreigners from abroad, became Americans. Not surprisingly, if you look at the economics of it, this big move of population, which was largely low-skilled newcomers, put pressure on wages for less skilled Americans and inculcated a resentment among some in the United States against unrestricted immigration. Increased, increased economic differences within, or contributed to the increase of economic differences within the United States, and a nativist or anti-immigration movement gathered in the U.S., starting in the Progressive Era, in the 1890s and the 1900s. It passed legislation at the state level, never quite got to legislation passing at the national level. But then World War I occurred, and that, of course, shut down all international movement across the Atlantic and much of the Pacific. And after World War I, strict laws were put in cordoning off immigration flows. These weren't relaxed until 1965. My point here is that people who say it can't happen here in the U.S. should know that it's already happened here once. And depending upon bad politics, political circumstances, it certainly could happen again. And if I were of the anti-immigration persuasion, which I'm not, I'm in favor, in general, of orderly migration to the United States. Um, I don't think that I could do anything more brilliant than the chaos that we see on the U.S. southern border today to poison the popular sentiment in the United States about future immigration. So I think this one is the jury is still out on whether the projections of future immigration in the census papers that you've described actually come to pass. As to the implications for the United States of changing ethnic composition, um, I'm uh, I'm certainly not of the I'm certainly not of the sensationalist school that one can find in different quarters on the left or on the right in the U.S. I mean, I go back to thinking of the U.S. in 1790 when we did our first population census as a young United States of America. The uh, the USA was almost apart from the enslaved Africans who became the future Black Americans, and from some Native Americans who were also within the territories, was was mainly a country made up of people from Britain and mainly made up by English and Scots and Welsh from Britain. And then over the next half century, you saw big migrations from Ireland and from Germany, and there were discussions at that time. How can an English society, an English heritage society, possibly absorb these Irish and these Germans? Uh, and then after the Civil War. How can it possibly absorb these Italians and these Slavs and these Jews and these Greeks? And then a little later on, how can it possibly absorb these Mexicans and these Caribbeans and these Asians? You'll see there was a theme here that's gone on for quite a while, and for all of the pains and problems that migration has brought. I don't want to sugarcoat those. I think the United States has done a pretty remarkable job of assimilating people from other parts of the world into loyal and productive Americans. Uh, and so there was a book with a wonderful title a few decades ago. It wasn't a very good book, but it had a wonderful title. It's called How the Irish Became White People. And it's all about the assimilation of the uh, impoverished, poorly educated, low-skilled refugees from the famines into the U.S. And after a number of generations, how they became quite prosperous and became mainstays of kind of like social establishment in the United States. Uh, that's a kind of a roundabout way of saying that I don't think we know uh, what political outlook or perspective people will have simply by knowing something uh, about their DNA and about their their parents' historical heritage. As long as the United States remains a society with openness and opportunity, I think there's going to be a lot of political fluidity in the future. I mean, as we speak, commentators have a great deal to say uh, about the tilt, for example, of Hispanic Americans towards towards voting as Republicans, and so some African American or Black men are turning more towards voting for Republicans. There was a time when there was a long period of time after the Civil War when Black Americans voted en masse as Republicans. That changed. Uh, so I I think it's a very risky thing to make projections about how human beings in an open mobile society will participate based upon their ethnic heritage.
Mhm. Yes, and of course, one of the great Irishmen of politics is Senator Moynihan, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, one of my favorite people to read. Um, he wrote a book that I really enjoyed in the 1990s called Pandemonium, in which
Mm,
I believe it was a series of lectures he did at Oxford,
yes.
in which he looks at the situation of ethnic conflict and cultural conflicts in post-Soviet Russia and um, post-Yugoslavia, Southern Europe, and um, he saw that there's something. I think this is an implicit message that, but he saw that there's something unique about America and how it, um, I suppose, integrates and assimilates multiple ethnicities and cultures into one republic, whereas the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and to some extent other nations, India included, could not. So, in your view, what is this secret sauce to multicultural American success?
Well, by the way, I knew Senator Moynihan myself. I served as I was what they called in those days, I was a section man. I headed one of the sections of his course, Soxi 118, Social Sciences and Social Policy, when he ran for senator in 1976. We kind of held the course together while he went down to campaign, and then he would come back and give his 2 lectures a week, and we'd do the third section. An extraordinary man, and an extraordinary political figure, and a remarkable intellectual as well. So, with a great deal of respect and affection for him. Uh, the the I don't know that the secret sauce for the US is unique to the USA. I mean, because I'm thinking, as you posed that question, about Canada, about Australia in particular, New Zealand as well. Um, Certainly within the Anglosphere, the I think of the Anglo-American tradition, but of course there are Anglo traditions in these other countries that I'm describing as well, which make for the possibility of open society, uh, individual rights, individual opportunity, respect for the individual, limited government, and tolerance. We see, I mean, we can make differentiations between these offshoots I've just described, but we see that in all of those countries as well. Uh, it's a slightly different model that we see in a place like Switzerland, which has also been very successful uh, in welcoming newcomers as productive and loyal visitors, not so much as citizens. Um, it's a different formula, which doesn't presume the sort of permanence that we have in the U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand. Switzerland's also a kind of a little place, so it can't make that much arithmetic difference in global migration. Um, but I don't think that there's any mystery in seeing uh, the heritage of, in a European sense, liberal ideals passed down in through politics in the Anglo tradition, and certainly as an American, without being trying to be too terribly chauvinist, I think there's a great deal of thought that was given to the U.S. experiment by our founders, and read back on the Federalists or look at the Constitution, kind of have to wonder how they ever did that. Without having foresight, how they ever put together an arrangement that might have the possibility for working as well as it did.
Yeah. I think of Senator Moynihan also when I read about the politics of the country that I'm currently at right now, Hungary. Um, One of Viktor Orban's is well-known policy that well, a surprising number of American conservatives are in favor of is provide tax incentives for women to give birth, I suppose Hungarian women. Um, and I think of Senator Moynihan and his quotation. I believe if you think that government can dictate family size and family matters, you know nothing about government or family planning. And uh, and learning from the experience of China as well as my own home country, Vietnam, which did impose a two-child limit on per family. I think that this experiment in Hungarian family planning, it's not going to end well. So I wonder to what extent have you know of this policy?
I've taken a look, and um, I've got some thoughts about it. I'm generally pretty skeptical about pronatal policies, about the demographic efficacy of pronatal policies. Um, you can see how antinatal policies can work work demographically, rate totals, as they did in China, as they did in more limited way in Vietnam. Because if you give police force to birth control cadres, they can they can use the power of the state to compel people to have fewer children than they wish to have. It's kind of harder to force people to have more children than they wish to have, though. Um, the the Hungary experiment has some very learned people in the wings. In particular, there's a eminence grise who's ancient now, a demographer named Paul Demain, who was at the Population Council for many decades, who edited the best journal on demographics in any language that I'm aware of, Population and Development Review. Um, the Orban government did not embrace every suggestion that Demain made. He has one intriguing suggestion, uh, mischievous perhaps, an intriguing suggestion that parents should be granted temporary privilege of the votes for their underage children. You can see how that would affect voting in societies. I mean, I'm not sure all the details were worked out. What if the two parents disagreed about some matter before the vote? I'm not sure those details were worked out, but as a thought experiment, you can see how this would tilt the balance of interests towards those who are having children and away from those who didn't have children. But be that as it may, uh, as regards the matter of fertility levels and childbearing levels, I don't think that the rather generous, expensive experiment in Hungary has much to show. Uh, the fertility levels are still decidedly below replacement. They're not that different from neighboring countries. That has not changed much. There is, however, one thing which has gone unremarked, which has changed a great deal. Because the benefits are conditioned upon uh, husband-wife unions, upon married couple unions. No one else, an unwed mother cannot receive the birth benefits in Hungary the way that unwed mothers could in East Germany and many other places, of course. Um, there has been in marriages in Hungary since the Orban programs came into effect. Hungary is the great exception in the Western world as regards marriage trends. The flight from marriage is happening everywhere in the Western world except in Hungary, and to some extent in Israel too, but that's a different story. So you could ask the question, even if uh, even if one recognized that there was going to be little to no effect upon birth totals, given the fact that human volition is the kind of the engine behind childbearing. Even if you recognized that this rather expensive, generous program would have very little effect on birth totals, would it be worthwhile to entertain such a program if you knew that this was going to have a big impact on marriage patterns in a country? I don't think that's a crazy question to ask. My guess is that reasonable people could come to very different conclusions about whether this was whether the benefits to society, the other knock-on benefits, if you will, to society from having more marriages, larger proportion of married couples, would be worth such an expense. But that discussion has not taken place yet, and perhaps it never will.
Mhm. Yes, which makes me to a remarkable difference between mainstream American conservatism and mainstream European conservatism. Um, I, yeah, I'm familiar enough with, I guess, American conservative literature, especially particularly that of, say, Charles Murray, whom you and I both know, that American conservatives tend to oppose the welfare state. You guys do whatever you can to stem the tide of welfare and all that. But European conservatives, they don't have a problem with it, especially, I don't think in Hungary. Many of them think that you can use the welfare state for conservative ends. And I believe it was Irving Kristol who wrote much about this too. And so I wonder from your American point of view, so is there any use for welfare and slash redistribution programs from the government?
Well, of course, the government, which is enormous in the United States, maybe not quite as enormous proportionately as in some other affluent democracies. But of course, there are purposes for government programs. Um, we have, we have our own national pension system called Social Security. We have our own old age health guarantees called Medicare. We have many other programs as well. Uh, we also have a tradition of voluntary individual philanthropic giving, which is not as established and prevalent in continental Europe as it is in the USA. Um, but so in principle, there are a lot of things government can do to affect individual well-being. Irving Kristol, whom you mentioned, as a person who taught an awful lot of us to look at unintended consequences, as well as don't look at the intention only, look at the unintended consequences, and then do a net assessment about how far you've gotten along. Um, I wrote an essay back in, I don't, maybe 2015 about the social welfare state in the USA. And I made the point that um, the organic historical development of the welfare state was from Europe, responding to European conditions. I mean, in Northern Europe, as you know, it started in Germany, started in the UK, started in Scandinavia. And uh, in part, it was a response to the perceived lack of opportunity due to class barriers in Europe. Now, one can always exaggerate. I mean, there are national myths, right? I mean, so in the United States, we have a national myth of unlimited opportunity. Obviously, opportunity is not unlimited, but our myth embraces this reflection in the national mirror that we tend to see. And maybe the class barriers weren't as absolutely stifling as the national myths in some of the European countries would have suggested. But it was a response to particular European conditions. Um, and that's one of the reasons that the welfare state came to the United States so very late. As of right at the beginning of the Great Depression, before Franklin Roosevelt was elected president, social welfare spending as a proportion of GDP was lower in 1930 than it had been in 1890, than it had been 40 years earlier. So the US was a rather resistant country. Um, it wasn't really until the 1960s, until the Great Society and the War on Poverty, that the US began to implement any sort of broad approach, uh, government aid conditioned upon lack of personal income. Uh, it was possible to have aid, government subsidies due to age. One's not able to work after a certain age. We had that. We didn't have programs conditioned upon poverty per se. And part of that was the deep and abiding almost Calvinistic Protestantism, not just among Protestants, but among all Americans, about this notion of deserving and undeserving poor. It's still there. I mean, our welfare state has grown enormously in the past generations, but that tradition is still there, and because that tradition is so different from what we see across the ocean in continental Europe and also in the UK, um, I argue that the welfare state has been grafted on to the U.S. body politic in a somewhat uneasy manner. We have more arguments about this over here in the United States than, as you say, than European conservatives ever would have.
Mhm. Yes. Of course, to see an exhibition of how social policies do not work as intended, of course, Chris Sosa's journal, The Public Interest, is a wonderful place for that.
Yeah, it was absolutely seminal, and it was a terribly important uh, e exercise in reportage, because the journal was founded at the almost at the beginning of the War on Poverty, so it was almost a quarter by quarter assessment of what was taking place.
Right. So final question. I believe that the allure of Hungary in this current Orbán government to, I suppose, non-Hungarian Western conservatives is that they feel that in places that like America or Canada or the United Kingdom, conservatives have either lost the battle or have been opted by non-conservative ideas, I suppose, globalization, or the increasing size of the state, or radical culture issues. And they see Hungary as this like oasis of sanity, so to speak, in this ocean of irrationalism. But I view that this overwhelming sense of pessimism among some, I guess, English-speaking conservative that teeters towards resignation, it's a lot less savory than it seems, and Hungary will not solve whatever problems that these pessimistic American conservatives may have. So I'd like to pass this one on to you. As a conservative, what's your case for optimism regarding the conservative cause?
Um, it's my case for optimism does not rise or fall upon the future of Viktor Orban. I'd start by saying that. One of the similarities between Viktor Orban and Donald Trump uh, is that they're both great performers, and they're they're relatively ineffective as executives. There's a great deal of performative art, um, which may satisfy immediate passions and um, may allow for people to feel ratified and valued in some sort of way, but um, how much either of them change change the contours and the realm of possibilities is another question altogether. I don't notice Viktor Orban leaving the EU. I do notice him with his hand out to Brussels all the time. So um, my case for optimism for what I would call conservatism, I you'd call it liberalism if you're in Europe. Um, Sometimes I suppose I would have called myself I call myself a neoconservative, although um, more in the spirit of Irving Kristol than of George W. Bush. Um, my my reason for confidence and optimism has to do with human nature. It has to do with, I think, the human spirit itself. There's a uh, uh, there's a thirst for truth. There's a thirst for meaning. Uh, there's a hunger for association and for achievement. I mean, he wasn't a conservative, but that old Greek fellow Aristotle, I think had it pretty right when he talked about human beings as being social animals that needed to get meaning from my words, not Aries, but from work, from family, from faith, from their communities. Um, all of these would be absolutely commonplace uh, propositions until a generation or two ago, when radical notions about changing human nature came along and started to have the power of government behind them. So, uh, since we've done such a tremendous job uh, in routinizing and systematizing the possibilities for prosperity around the world, uh, I think we've got a lot of reason to be optimistic that we can achieve uh, what uh, what we also need to reflect more on is the non-material needs of our nature. And I think that is where what is now called conservatism, um, which may be more uh, more closely approximates some of the obvious aspects of human nature, uh, can find resonance in the future.
I think that's a very good note to end on. Thank you very much, Nick Eberstadt, for joining this show.
Thank you for inviting me again. Your questions are always excellent. I love the way you think.